In 1985, a studio known for wildly entertaining low-budget B-movies suddenly spent $25 million on what they swore would be their prestige blockbuster. The movie had space vampires, a naked alien wandering through London, and a miniatures-built apocalypse. And it bombed. Hard. In the US, it earned just $11.6 million against that budget, and was the beginning of the end for Cannon Films. But here's the twist. Later home video releases and the restoration of a longer international cut gave audiences a chance to see it differently. Why did crowds run from Lifeforce back then, and why do fans adore it now? To answer that question, you'd have to first understand the gamble behind its creation. In the early 1980s, Cannon Films built its name on fast, cheap entertainment. Audiences knew them for streamlined action. Charles Bronson gunning down street thugs, or Chuck Norris cleaning out jungle compounds one roundhouse at a time. These were modestly made productions, but they worked on volume. Cannon's co-owners, Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, built a pipeline that put out a steady stream of action, exploitation, and genre fare, counting on each release to turn a small, reliable profit to fund more features. A jarring break with this philosophy is why the industry was stunned when news broke that this same company had committed $25 million to a science fiction epic. For Cannon, it was one of the largest budgets in their history, a scale usually reserved for major studios chasing Star Wars-sized dreams. This sudden pivot signaled something bigger than just a movie. They wanted critical recognition, not just cash flow. To show they were serious, they partnered with director Tobe Hooper. Hooper, who was coming off the success of Poltergeist, would give the production an added air of legitimacy. Cannon signed him to a 3-picture deal, convinced Hooper would help pull them out of the genre film abyss. One of these 3 promised films would become Lifeforce. At first, it was bluntly titled The Space Vampires, taken directly from Colin Wilson's source novel. But Cannon quickly realized the campy title undercut their ambitions.
Was an allergy, an allergic reaction, I should say, to the title, Space Vampires. Is that a right title? I mean, does this sound too much like, an Italian film of, say, 10 years ago?
They swapped it for a more serious single word, Lifeforce. In the film, astronauts discover humanoid aliens encased in crystal. One of them is a striking, unclothed woman who ends up on Earth and begins draining human life as a power source for an impending apocalypse. It was pure pulp dressed as prestige, and no new title could disguise that. The problems piled up quickly. Cannon poured money into elaborate special effects, colossal spacecraft designed like Baroque sculptures, glowing energy blasts, entire streets of London aflame. They leaned into nudity and lurid horror for shock value even as they insisted the production was their answer to mainstream studio filmmaking. That tension meant the movie couldn't simply be dismissed as exploitation. At $25 million, with Cannon promoting it as a major event, critics and audiences were forced to measure it against Hollywood's biggest blockbusters. The odds of it surviving that comparison were poor. What makes Cannon's gamble striking is how uncompromising it was. Every eccentric visual choice, every bold narrative swing was amplified by the pressure of the budget and the studio's lofty goals. Their pursuit of legitimacy built expectations the movie was never designed to meet. And when those expectations collided with the finished product's unruly personality, the result was a film that seemed impossible to pin down. And that is the paradox at the center of Lifeforce, a gigantic investment in a story that constantly slips away from conventional boundaries, one weird decision at a time. The opening minutes of Lifeforce suggest a straightforward science fiction film. A shuttle crew approaches Halley's Comet and stumbles onto a vast, cathedral-like alien ship hidden within its tail. Inside, they discover 3 naked humanoids sealed within crystalline cases, eerily lifelike yet perfectly still. The sequence carries the mood of Alien, a slow exploration of the unknown that hints at a disciplined thriller. But that impression vanishes almost immediately. Once the supposed survivors are brought back to Earth, the movie flips into something closer to a gothic vampire tale. Except the feeding is psychic, not blood-based. Just as the audience adjusts to that premise, another transformation arrives. Victims drained of their life force don't become elegant immortals. They twitch and collapse into husks, and then reanimate like zombies driven by a contagious hunger. Labs and hospitals erupt in chaos as corpses crumble into ash. Then, once again, the scope expands. By the film's climax, London burns under skies of radiant energy while St. Paul's Cathedral becomes the epicenter of a supernatural beam tearing into the heavens. At one point, Patrick Stewart endures a grotesque possession that ends with torrents of blood erupting across the screen. only to be followed later by wide-scale disaster imagery lifted from 1970s spectacle dramas. Each shift feels less like a twist and more like a new film altogether. This constant refashioning of genre left viewers in 1985 grasping for footing. One scene anchors itself in forensic horror, then the next makes room for erupting effects carnage. Instead of a steady arc, the narrative stacks itself like mismatched building blocks. For some audiences at the time, that meant incoherence. But a closer look reveals it wasn't random chance. Tobe Hooper himself explained that his target was not just a sci-fi adventure, but an operatic, modern Hammer-style picture.
And I thought, I'll go back to my roots, and I'll make a 70 millimeter Hammer film.
Hooper wanted to borrow that atmosphere while amplifying it with widescreen spectacle and cutting-edge effects, creating a scale that Hammer never attempted. Understanding that intent reframes the chaos. Lifeforce did not settle for being just a genre piece about cosmic vampires. It insisted on escalating into plague horror, possession theatrics, and citywide annihilation. Critics called it incoherent, yet fans who return decades later often see ambition peeking through the mess. Its refusal to stay anchored in one genre lends the movie a bold, jagged rhythm, as if every reel promised to top the last with something stranger, louder, or more elaborate. That unpredictable approach earned the film its reputation for bewildering excess on screen. But if watching it felt unstable, what happened behind the camera was even harder to control. Lifeforce was meant to be Cannon's crown jewel, the movie that proved they could stand alongside the major studios. Instead, its production became a test of limits, straining a company unprepared for a film of that scale. Reports say the shoot went 5 weeks over schedule, and at one point cameras stopped entirely while financing was renegotiated. For a studio used to finishing pictures in record time, those delays were not only unfamiliar, they were financially dangerous. I mean, just think about the destruction of London, one of the film's most ambitious showpieces. Rather than relying on matte paintings alone, the crew built elaborate scale models at the Tuctonia Model Village. These miniatures, wired with explosives and flame effects, recreated an entire burning city. The results were striking on screen, but the time and cost drained resources exactly when Cannon's balance sheet was weakest. It was a fitting irony. As technicians set a model London on fire, Cannon was basically burning $100 bills. The visual effects demanded an equally high price. John Dykstra, already famous for his Oscar-winning work on Star Wars, was brought in to design complex optical sequences. Astronauts floating through organic spacecraft, radiant energy beams streaking across the frame, and bodies disintegrating into dust. These were practical compositions requiring painstaking setups. Though the artistry was undeniable, Dykstra's team would later win a special effects award at the Sitges Film Festival for their work, the complexity only underlined how far beyond its comfort zone Cannon had ventured. A studio built on quick action films suddenly had to navigate problems of visual engineering it had never faced before. The cast, meanwhile, carried their own burdens. 19-year-old Matilda May, in her first film role, was directed to perform nearly all of her scenes nude on cold stages. Reports note that much of her dialogue was learned phonetically, adding another layer of difficulty to work already shot under intense scrutiny and frequently on closed sets. The production leaned heavily on her appearance, framing her body as a spectacle throughout. Patrick Stewart, meanwhile, found himself in one of the most notorious sequences, convulsing in a possession scene that culminated with torrents of blood erupting from his mouth. To look back at an established actor committing so fully to a sequence so bizarre only reinforced the sense of a film veering between ambition and excess. Post-production only deepened the fractures. Hooper's first assembly cut of the film reportedly ran around 128 minutes. From there, the film splintered into multiple versions, including an international release running about 116 minutes and a US theatrical cut reduced to roughly 101. In the process, character material and much of Henry Mancini's score were ripped away. The American cut in particular felt jagged, less like a movie than a reel of highlights stitched together. What was intended as an operatic, oversized spectacle instead played to US audiences as a confusing, over-edited mess. And even that wasn't the end of the compromises. Getting a film like Lifeforce into American theaters meant facing another obstacle, one that would prove just as challenging as budget overruns or runaway effects. They were going to have to square off with the MPAA. How do you promote a summer release when one of your lead characters spends nearly every scene without clothes? That was the challenge Cannon and distributor TriStar faced with Lifeforce. Matilda May, who turned 19 years old during the filming and was a new face on screen, was cast as Space Girl. May was chosen after producers reportedly auditioned hundreds, and some accounts say thousands, of actresses, many of whom refused the role due to the required nudity.
There was a problem in the UK with the actresses not taking their clothes off.
May accepted, and much of the film was built around her presence. But while the production treated her performance as central to the story's menace, the marketing stripped it down to one point: come see the naked alien. Posters, trailers, and the press materials leaned hard on that framing, sparking notoriety, but also locking the film into controversy. On set, May endured conditions that made the assignment far from comfortable. Multiple sequences required her to perform nude for hours on refrigerated sound stages.
It was freezing cold, and I had to take my clothes off. It was lonely sometimes.
Remaining motionless while cameras repositioned, often on closed sets set to limit the crew. She was not given a lot of dialogue and relied heavily on physical expression to carry her scenes. Yet coverage in the American press rarely acknowledged this effort. Instead, reviews reduced her work to an exhibition, cataloging exposure rather than considering how she handled what was a really challenging role. TriStar's handling of the film further complicated things. To secure a mainstream US release, executives ordered a shorter domestic cut, trimming material and reducing the runtime by more than 15 minutes. They also added new musical cues by Michael Kamen and James Guthrie in place of sections of Mancini's original score. The result was meant to soften or reframe sequences that might have otherwise earned the ire of the ratings board. What audiences got was a version stripped of coherence, but still provocative enough to raise objections, leaving it in an uncanny middle ground, censored yet somehow still scandalous. Beyond its marketing and editing, the film's metaphorical undertones made some people uncomfortable. At its core, Lifeforce depicted vitality transferred through intimate contact, with victims literally consumed by desire. Many later critics and scholars interpreted this against the backdrop of 1980s AIDS anxiety, seeing the story as a subconscious echo of fears about infection and sex. The film also unsettled some audiences by presenting attraction and life force transfer between men as well as between women and men, tipping into homoerotic suggestion at a time when genre films rarely engaged with those themes so directly. None of this was subtle, and for mid-1980s American theaters, it was more than enough to compound the scandal already surrounding its imagery. The outcome was a split-personality film. British theaters played the longer cut with more of the spectacle intact: zombie eruptions, chaos in London, and Mancini's operatic score in full force. American theaters, meanwhile, received a choppier version that pleased few. Critics labeled it as nonsensical, and audiences left confused or indifferent. What had been marketed through scandal became dismissed as a failure. Yet, the very elements that panicked distributors and perplexed audiences, the nudity, the metaphors, and the genre-bending overload of it all, were the seeds of something else. In time, they would be the same reason people sought the film out again, not as a hit, but as an object of fascination. When it closed in 1985, Lifeforce had the numbers of a box office disaster. Canada poured $25 million into the production, and the film's US box office stopped at just $11.6 million. What was meant to be the studio's prestige breakthrough collapsed instead into an industry punchline. To casual audiences, it looked like an awkward hybrid. Too expensive to be Grindhouse, too bizarre to compete with mainstream hits. Critics called it tacky, and it slipped into the same VHS racks that held dozens of cheaper horror and sci-fi titles. But like so many films of this era, home video kept the title alive, just not in the way Cannon had intended. MGM UA's 1994 Laserdisc release offered the longer international cut, and some sharp-eyed fans noticed it was a different movie than the one they remembered from theaters. Scenes felt more fleshed out. Henry Mancini's orchestral score hammered harder, and the narrative had a stranger, more operatic energy. Horror magazines and convention chatter turned the alternate version into a small underground legend. Watching both cuts of the film and comparing notes almost became a rite of passage. As formats changed, the film kept resurfacing. DVD circulation expanded its reach, and fan commentary shifted from groaning about its incoherence to admiring what it pulled off. Viewers began pointing out details that had been buried in the theatrical write-offs. The elaborate miniature work used to level London, John Dykstra's complex effects sequences, and Mancini's full-length score that had been clipped in the American cut. Even Matilda May's performance, so quickly dismissed by critics in 1985, turned into a cult calling card, celebrated not for the scandal, but for how fearless and central she was to the film's impact. The real pivot, however, came with Blu-ray. In 2013, Scream Factory's release collected both cuts of the film with commentaries and extras. In the UK, Arrow Films reissued a companion edition around the same time. With these releases, audiences could compare the theatrical version with Hooper's longer version side by side, while also hearing the production story directly from the cast and crew. That cleaner presentation reframed the movie. What once seemed like a confused failure now looked like the product of a specific ambition, filtered through studio compromise. Later 4K editions kept that momentum, and by then, the film's reputation had shifted permanently. Today, Lifeforce sits in a peculiar but secure position. Critical consensus remains mixed, but reappraisals now highlight its audacity. Roger Ebert dismissed it as absurd. Gene Siskel, on the other hand, famously called it a guilty pleasure. Fans now view its excesses as strengths rather than liabilities, treating it as a technical relic with ideas bigger than it was able to pull off. That shift in perception sets the stage for what Lifeforce ultimately illustrates about cinema. How a work once ridiculed can, through persistence and reevaluation, find its way into cultural longevity. Lifeforce shows how extremes that doomed the film in 1985 became the very qualities that secured its cult status. Things that were once counted as liabilities, the nudity, the operatic spectacle, and the unchecked shifts in genre, turned into assets once home video audiences had access to a fuller cut that revealed the rawness and sincerity behind it. And I, for one, am glad it did, because Lifeforce is one of those films that everyone should check out, especially if you love weird cult cinema. Ready to perform another cinematic postmortem on a great film? Then be sure to check out my video on Dark City. You'll find a link here on the screen. I hope to see you over there.